sort of feel like I'm the vegetables in this feast of information. We've had a delicious entree from Ben and a meaty talk on education, and you're now really looking forward to the just desserts of social services and the green after dinner mint of environmental services. But first you have to munch your way through the broccoli of taxation in the budget. So I'll try not to be too dull, and I'll try to be reasonably quick. First, a quick plug for my organisation. I work for the Centre for Policy Development, and there's our website if you want to find out more about us. One of the things I do work on is public services in general, and that's why I've been asked to talk about taxation, because obviously that's the revenue that drives public services. So, starting off with a warning about what I'm going to say. 10 minutes is not a long time, probably a good thing when talking about tax, but it does mean that I have to gloss over a number of important details. The benefit for you is that I will also gloss over a number of completely irrelevant details. For example, are you aware that this year the federal government has doubled, and I'll say that again, has doubled the levy on mushroom spawn? I knew you'd be shocked. So what I'm going to do, instead of dealing with trivial things, is talk about a number of key changes, some of which have already been mentioned, and try and give a bit of context around them, give a bit of meaning to what's happened in taxation, because like your broccoli, it's dull, but it's important. Okay, so first of all, starting off with the income tax, the temporary budget repair levy. Let's call a spade a spade. It's the rich tax. 2% on taxable income above 180k for 3 years. And there's the revenue. Now, I've put disputed there on what it's going to actually do to the budget bottom line. But that is disputed because there is an argument that people on very high incomes will actually be able to shift their wealth out of that bracket by doing less work or tax minimisation. One wag in the media has actually called it the tax on rich people who don't have accountants. Just to give a bit of historical context on what's happening to income taxes over time. This is it's not the clearest graph in the world, so I'll talk you through it. This is the tax brackets of income tax. This is what's happened to them. Now, unfortunately, this graph is a couple of years old, so it doesn't show, for instance, the Gillard's increase of the tax threshold for people paying no income tax. But essentially, that black line is the median income. This is not adjusted for inflation, but we're talking about the relative levels here, so that's okay. What you can see is that largely there has been no bracket creep. The tax brackets have been adjusted roughly lines in speaking with people's increase in earnings, except for the top tax bracket, which, as you can see in the Howard and Rudd years, with Rudd implementing a number of the changes that Howard had first proposed, Rudd in Me Too mode, dramatically increased the level of the top tax bracket. So what that means is that back in 94-95, if you were on 80k, you'd be well inside the top tax bracket and paying that top tax bracket for a significant proportion of your income. Assuming your income over the next few years kept pace, roughly speaking, with the median, then you'd be, say, on 100k, maybe a little higher, in 2010, 2011. You're nowhere near the top tax bracket. Now, also, note the numbers in white. They're the actual percentage you pay in each tax bracket, and they're all going down. So, now, what this levy has done is in that top purple tax bracket, the 45 has now gone back up to 47. So, all this is a temporary and very much partial winding back of some very unwise tax cuts taken a while ago. Moving on to the tax on carbon, you're all aware that the Abbott government is increasing the taxation on carbon. No, you weren't aware of that? I'm talking about the fuel excise indexation, of course. So, fuels, the fuel tax, rather than staying constant as it was since I think 2001, will now be twice a year, indexed based on CPI, so it will be increasing. And a number of people have stated that in the long run this will actually mean that the fuel excise will be more significant than the emissions trading scheme. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument, and the reason why is You can just see the difference in the amount of money that they were predicted to bring in over the forward estimates. Still, it's a reasonable point that the fuel excise will have an effect of reducing carbon, but of course it's hitting, rather as opposed to the emissions trading scheme, which hit very large corporations, it's hitting everybody who drives. So now, of course, technically that was the carbon tax, if you want to call it a tax, and that's an interesting question for a number of different reasons, both economic and political. The emissions trading scheme was not actually pulled in this budget, it was technically pulled in the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook, MYFO. I'm aware of not taking up too much of time. I do want to mention two other taxes that Ben also referred to. The mineral resource rent tax. So that's, again, like the emissions trading scheme, due to be repealed, which was flagged in the MYFO, but like the emissions trading scheme, it's not guaranteed that that will actually happen. But just to give a bit of context around the MRRT, Australian mining tax without it probably sits at around 13%. Now, the original super profits tax was to come in at 40% for some of the income, and what was introduced was 22.5%. Norway has a 78% tax on its mining activities. So, now admittedly Norway is very much the highest, but even so, the claim that mining can't possibly be profitable at these levels is ludicrous. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have moved on there. I also wanted to mention the company tax, which again Ben referred to, and again it's not certain as to whether it will come in. In particular, it was not detailed individually in the budget, and so that does seem to indicate there's some uncertainty as to whether those changes to the company tax will go through. And the effect of the changes are a reduced tax for small and medium corporations, assuming that the whole package goes through. Moving on to GST, which wasn't mentioned in the budget, or it was in kind of an implicit sense, because when you pull 80 billion worth of funding away from the states and then say, well, you've got to work out how to fund the money, and their major way of finding money is through GST, well, it does lead to a certain conclusion. So there is, the speculation is widespread that this, what is going through the government's head here is that they want the states to ask the federal government to increase GST. GST is often actually argued to be a really bad idea on the basis that it's a regressive tax. Consumption taxes do tend to be regressive because consumption tends to take up a much larger proportion of the budget of lower income families and individuals than it does for higher income. However, there are a couple of features of GST in Australia that make that argument slightly more complex. What we're talking about with change in GST is a change in both scope and size. Size in terms of increasing the percentage amount, but also scope in terms of what it applies to. It doesn't, for instance, currently apply to education costs or fresh food. In increasing its scope, a lot of the increases in scope that have been discussed will actually disproportionately affect the wealthy. So, for instance, spending on private education will then come under this tax. As well as that, because the GST goes entirely towards the states, which do most of the frontline public service work, the majority of that money will be spent targeted at lower income families and individuals. So there are some calculations out there to say that an increase in GST is actually a progressive measure. That's something that's up for debate, but I looked at the complexity for you. So comes to the end of the kind of the major changes that I wanted to just give you some context to. Now just to finish off with some overall context, you notice most of the figures I put up were single-digit billions of dollars. The total size of the budget is $350 billion, and upwards. So these are not massive changes, and indeed what was probably missing in this budget was significant tax reform. Now, admittedly, the government is waiting on a white paper on taxation, but I note that they managed to get their Commission of Audit report out before the budget, but not the white paper, which I think shows where their priorities lie. There is the need for significant tax reform that's simpler and fairer and generates the revenue that we need. And this comes back to an important point. One of the reasons perhaps why tax is boring but necessary is because tax is ultimately the size of government. Government can generate some money from borrowing in the short term, but it has to pay that back eventually. There are other revenue streams, but they're very small. Essentially, the size of your government is the size of your taxation. And by the way, we are around about, say, 31% of GDP is our taxation across all levels of government. Norway's at 57%, so nearly double us, and doing just fine. Germany also doing well on 45%. There is no one right size of government. There have been a number of claims that certain sizes of government are more efficient or better performing economically. The evidence for that is extremely thin. So, but questions about the size of government kind of miss the point. When you look at people's attitudes to what size government should be, what levels of taxation, there's a recent poll by ANU. When Australians are asked about their taxes, 51% say they're about right, 35% say they're too high, about 3% say they're too low. 10% say they don't know. 10% is an awfully lot of people who don't know for such an important issue. But it's reasonable because your taxation, is your taxation fair? Is it reasonable? Well, it depends on what it's being spent on. The more interesting question is about the role of government, and once we determine the role of government, then we can sensibly talk about what size government should be in order to fund that role. And the role of government is, of course, things like education, things like social service provisions, things like environmental services. So I'll leave that question to further speakers. Thank you very much.